My name is Nelson Merritt. I am 62 years old, and the calluses on my hands never fully disappeared, even after I stopped working the floor. I want to tell you about the day my son-in-law stood in front of 40 of my employees, called me the kind of man who could never survive in the modern business world, and then watched the whole room go completely still. It did not go still because anyone agreed with him. It went still because Carrie from HR had just pulled up the company's real ownership documents, and every person in that room could read the signature line that had been sitting underneath their paychecks the whole time. My daughter, Lauren, had begged me for 3 years not to make things difficult. I honored that. I sat at her dinner table and let her husband finish his sentences. I drove 2 hours to his office Christmas party and stood by the snack table all night like a piece of furniture. I kept quiet when he corrected me. I kept quiet when he smiled at me like I was a harmless old man from another century. But when he put 40 working families on the line, that was when I stopped being the quiet man in the corner. This is where the story really began. I grew up in Harwick, Ohio. If you have never heard of it, that sounds about right. It was the kind of town where everybody's dad worked at the steel plant, and if you were lucky, you owned 2 pairs of shoes. 1 pair for school, and 1 pair for everything else. My father worked the night shift his entire adult life. I never heard him complain, not once. He came home at 6 in the morning, ate whatever my mother had left covered on the stove, and slept until noon. Then he got up and did it all over again. I started in a machine shop when I was 19. Lathes, mill presses, coolant that smelled like rust and petroleum. I did not mind the work. I understood work. What I minded was the ceiling above it. I minded the feeling that no matter how good I became, no matter how early I arrived or how late I stayed, I was still only a body filling a slot. So when I was 32, I opened Merritt Industrial Supply out of a 2-bay garage on Route 9. I had 3 employees, 1 forklift that broke down twice a month, and a wife who thought I had lost my mind. Her name was Carol, and even when she thought I was crazy, she supported me anyway. 22 years later, we had 120 people on payroll. Most of them came from Harwick and the surrounding towns. They were people who needed a steady check, good benefits, and a boss who remembered their kids' names. I tried to be that boss. I did not always get everything right, but I never forgot that the names on a payroll were not just numbers. They were mortgages, groceries, braces, gas tanks, college funds, hospital bills, and Christmas mornings. When Carol got sick, I kept running the company because I had to. The work kept me upright. She passed when our daughter, Lauren, was 14, and after that, the company became more than a business to me. It was the thing I knew how to keep alive when I did not know how to keep anything else from falling apart. When I was 58, I sold 70% of the company to Hartwell Capital Group, a private equity firm out of Charlotte. They renamed it Hartwell Industrial Supply. They gave it a fresh logo, new letterhead, and the kind of corporate font that made everything look cleaner than it felt. But I kept 30%, a seat on the advisory board, and 1 specific clause in the operating agreement that my lawyer told me was unusual. I told him it was non-negotiable. They signed it anyway. I do not think they read it closely. Men in expensive suits rarely read the fine print written by men in flannel shirts. Lauren met Damien Holt at a networking event in Charlotte. She called me that same night, her voice pitched a little higher than usual, the way it always did when she was trying not to sound too excited about something. Damien had an MBA from Duke. He worked in operations consulting. He had a plan for everything, she told me, and she meant it as a compliment. I met him 3 months later at a restaurant near her apartment. He had a firm handshake and eyes that scanned the room twice while we were being seated. He was not nervous. He was calculating. He asked me polite questions, then talked about himself for 45 minutes. Lauren looked at him the whole time like he was a light source. I told myself that she was happy, and that was what mattered. They married when Lauren was 30. I walked her down the aisle and shook Damien's hand at the altar. His grip was good. I noticed that his eyes still moved. The first year, he was cordial. He showed up for holidays. He remembered to ask about my knee surgery. Year 2 was when things started to shift. He began correcting me. Gently at first, then less gently. If I said something about supply chain logistics at the dinner table, he redirected the conversation and explained that the current model worked differently. If I mentioned anything about the old company, he nodded slowly, like a professor acknowledging a student who had almost gotten the answer right. Lauren would catch my eye across the table and mouth, "Please, Dad." So I let it go. Again and again, I let it go. Here's the part that matters. Damien was recruited by Hartwell Capital 2 years after the acquisition, Director of Operations. By then, the company had changed its name, its logo, and its entire leadership structure. His onboarding documents referred to the original ownership as the prior ownership group. That was standard language in private equity acquisition paperwork, designed to present a clean break. There was no mention of my name, no mention of the founding story. No one told him. Lauren had asked me very directly not to complicate things, so I did not say a word. Damien had no idea he was walking into my house. Christmas Eve of 2023, we were at Lauren and Damien's house in Dublin, just outside Columbus. It was a nice place. Damien had picked it out. He mentioned the square footage often enough that I could have repeated it back to him if I wanted to. Lauren had made her mother's pot roast recipe. My grandson, Tyler, was 7 years old, and he sat next to me for most of dinner, narrating a video game I had never heard of. I did not mind. I liked listening to him. His voice reminded me of Lauren when she was little, before life taught her how to make herself smaller around difficult people. Damien was talking about the company. Q3 numbers, the upcoming restructure, and a plan he called Phase 2. He used a lot of words I recognized and a few I did not. At some point, he mentioned cutting positions on the plant floor. I put my fork down and told him those people had families. It was a simple statement, not an argument. Damien looked at me, then he looked at Lauren. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled the way people smile when they think they are being patient. He set down his wine glass and told me that, with all due respect, he would never hire someone like me. No degree, no management credentials, no real understanding of how modern operations worked. Then he paused and said I had built something in a different era, and that era was gone. The table went quiet. Tyler stopped talking about his video game. Lauren looked down at her plate. I picked up my fork. I finished my dinner. I helped clear the dishes. I kissed my daughter goodnight and said goodbye to Tyler. I shook Damien's hand at the door. Then I drove home alone on the dark highway, 47 miles, and I did not turn on the radio. That night, Lauren called me. She told me Damien had not meant it like that. She asked me not to make it a thing. I told her okay, and I did not make it a thing. Not yet. 6 weeks later, Damien called me with an invitation. It was a Tuesday afternoon. He told me they were doing a quarterly all-hands the following Friday, and he wanted me to come as a family guest. He said it would be good for me to see what Lauren's husband actually did. He had a particular way of pausing after a sentence like that, letting it settle as if he had just given me something important. I said yes. I did not explain why. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a few minutes. Then I called my attorney, Frank Doyle, who had been handling my affairs since before Lauren was born. I asked him to pull out the Hartwell operating agreement, specifically Section 7.3 and Section 4.1. I wanted to confirm that everything was still in effect. Frank called back within an hour. Everything was intact. Nobody had ever moved to amend it. He asked me if I wanted him to do anything with it. I told him not yet. I only wanted to make sure. Then I sent a short, professional email to Carrie Oakes, the HR director at Hartwell Industrial. I had met Carrie twice. Once when the acquisition closed, and once when she came out to Harwick for an employee benefits review. She was thorough, and she was quiet, and she had the kind of eyes that took notes even when her hands were not moving. I told Carrie I would be attending the all-hands that Friday as a guest. I cited Section 7.3 and Section 4.1 of the operating agreement and asked her to have the ownership disclosure documentation available if needed. Her reply came 4 hours later. She told me, "Of course, Mr. Merritt, I will have everything ready." Nothing more, no questions, no alarm, just, of course. That was when I understood something. Carrie had known who I was from the beginning. Her role was compliance and governance. She reported directly to the board, not to Damien. She had been sitting on that information for 2 years, doing her job correctly, waiting for the day someone with standing actually invoked it. Thursday evening, my phone rang. It was Walt Pruitt. Walt had been running the plant floor since 2003. He was the kind of man who showed up 20 minutes early every day and never once asked for a raise. He just did the work and expected to be treated fairly in return. I had always tried to give him that. His voice was lower than usual. He asked me if I had heard about Phase 2. I told him I had heard the outline. Walt told me it was 38 positions, plant floor, all production staff, Tommy Greer, Diane Holloway, the Kowalski brothers, people who had been there since before the name changed. People who had been there before any of the new folks ever set foot in the building. I knew those names. Tommy had worked for me since he was 23. Diane had started as a receptionist and cross-trained herself into quality control. The Kowalski brothers, Pete and Danny, had been on the loading dock so long they had become part of the architecture. Walt told me the board had already provisionally approved it. Damien had the recommendation drafted. It only needed one final signature to go to implementation. I already knew what that meant. The operating agreement was clear. Any restructuring affecting more than 10 positions required written approval from the retained interest holder. That was me. It had always been me. The Hartwell people had inherited that clause when they bought the company, and not one of them had ever looked at it closely enough to understand what they had agreed to. Walt asked me if there was anything I could do. I thought about Christmas Eve. I thought about the table going quiet. I told him I was coming Friday. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest about something. If Damien had only insulted me at that dinner, I might have let it go forever. I had swallowed worse for Lauren's sake, but 40 families is a different kind of math. Friday morning, I got up at 5:30, the same time I had gotten up when I was running the company. I put on khaki pants and the blue flannel shirt I had owned for 15 years, the one I used to wear on the floor. It still fit. I drove the 47 miles to Columbus, the same route I had driven 1,000 times. I went off Route 70, past the airport, and through the suburb where they had built the new office park. The building sat at the end of a landscape drive with a Hartwell Industrial sign out front, brushed aluminum, corporate font. It was a nice sign. There was nothing wrong with it. I pulled into the parking lot 20 minutes early and sat in my truck. The layout of the building was the same as I had designed it. The main entrance, the corner windows in the conference room, the way the loading bay curved behind the east wing. I had drawn all of that on a legal pad in 1994. The sign was different. Everything else was mine. I watched people arrive. Young professionals in fleece pullovers. A few faces I recognized from the old days. Then I saw Walt crossing the parking lot in his work boots, with his collar buttoned wrong on one side. He spotted my truck and changed direction. He knocked on the window, and I rolled it down. For a moment, he did not say anything. His eyes were red at the rims. He told me he had not thought I would come. I told him I had said I would. He nodded, and we walked in together. Damien was in the lobby near the coffee station, talking to two younger managers. He looked over when we came through the door, and something moved across his face. Surprise, maybe, or a quick recalculation. He told me I had actually come. Then he told me to grab a seat in the back so I could get a feel for how they ran things now. I told him that was fine. I had never needed the last word to win. Walking into that building was stranger than I expected. I passed the same break room where I once had to let my first bad employee go, and where a week later I hired the best floor supervisor I ever had. The plaques on the wall were different, the carpet was new, but every hallway, every fire exit, every corner of that place was still inside my head because I had drawn the original floor plan on a legal pad 30 years before. If you have ever walked back into a place that used to be yours, you know exactly what that feels like. The conference room held about 50 people comfortably. That morning, there were people standing along the back wall. Walt and I took 2 chairs near the end of the last row. A few people nodded at Walt. No one nodded at me. To them, I was just a stranger in a blue flannel shirt. Damien stood at the front of the room with a clicker in his hand and a slide deck on the screen behind him. He had the posture of someone who had practiced, shoulders back, feet planted, pauses in the right places. He walked the room through the Q3 numbers. They were good numbers, he said. Solid margins. Some supply chain wins. The room stayed polite and attentive. Then a new slide appeared. Phase 2, workforce restructure. Blue headers, white background, clean font. 38 positions. Plant floor. Effective March 1. The room changed. I could feel it before I could see it. The silence had a different weight. A few people looked down at their hands. Someone near the middle leaned slightly toward the person next to them. Tommy Greer was 3 rows ahead of me. I could see the back of his neck. Damien kept talking. Cost reduction, modernization, long-term competitiveness. The words came out smooth and practiced, and I had no doubt he believed every one of them. Then he looked up from the slide. He scanned the room the way he always did, and he found me at the back. A small smile crossed his face. Since they had a guest with them that day, he gestured toward me and invited me to come up. He said he could walk me through the reasoning and get a traditional perspective in the room. He meant it as a prop. I knew that as clearly as I knew the floor under my shoes. He wanted an object lesson. He wanted a moment where the room could see how thoroughly he could hold his own against the old way of doing things. I stood up. I walked to the front. And as I walked, I thought, he has no idea what he just did. Damien handed me the microphone with the same ease a man uses when he believes he controls the room. I held it and took a breath. From where I stood, I could see every face. Walt, near the back wall. Tommy Greer, 3 rows in. Diane Holloway, on the left side, with her hands folded. 2 of Damien's junior managers near the front, already arranging their faces into polite skepticism, ready for the folksy old-timer speech they assumed was coming. I looked at Damien and told him that before I answered, I wanted him to tell the room who had final approval authority on any restructuring plan under the operating agreement. There was a beat of silence. Damien tilted his head and said the final authority would obviously be the Hartwell Capital Board. I turned toward Carrie Oakes, who was seated along the sidewall with her laptop open in front of her. I asked her to pull up Section 7.3 of the operating agreement and put it on the screen. Damien straightened. He asked why she would do that. I reminded him that he had asked me up there to be transparent, so we were going to be transparent. Carrie's fingers moved across the keyboard. She did not hesitate, not even for a full second. The slide deck behind Damien went dark, and a PDF document appeared in its place, white pages, black text, the kind of formatting that belongs to lawyers. The room went completely still. Damien turned to look at the screen, then at Carrie, then at me. The air conditioning hummed. Someone coughed once, then stopped. Damien said my name quietly. I told him to give Carrie a moment. Carrie scrolled to Section 7.3. It filled the screen behind Damien's head. The room read it. I could tell by the way their eyes moved from left to right, then back again. The way people read something they need to be absolutely sure about. Section 7.3 stated that all workforce restructuring plans affecting more than 10 positions required prior written approval from the retained interest holder, Nelson J. Merritt, whose 30% retained interest included veto authority over payroll and staffing decisions. Carrie scrolled slightly. Section 4.1 stated that payroll disbursement authority remained with the retained interest holder until a full buyout was executed under the terms of Schedule A. A young woman near the middle of the room, marketing from the look of her lanyard, turned to the man beside her and said something too quiet for me to hear. He shook his head slowly. One of Damien's junior managers looked down at the table. Then, from the back of the room, Walt Pruitt spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried anyway. He said I was the man who built the place, and the room understood. For 30 seconds, there was only silence. Then, one person near the middle of the room began to clap. A few more joined. It was not a standing ovation. It was not theatrical. It was the sound of people who had been holding something in and finally had somewhere to put it. Damien stood at the front of the room, with the document projected above him. His face had lost its color. He looked at the screen, at Carrie, and then at me. Then he did it again. I let the applause finish. Then I answered his original question. I told the room I did not see value in eliminating 38 positions that could be handled through a phased automation plan. I told them I would like to present that plan if the room was willing. No one said they were not. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. I presented the automation plan, an 18-month rollout that would absorb most of the floor positions through cross-training and attrition rather than termination. I had drafted it in the weeks after Walt first raised the alarm about Phase 2. My advisory board seat gave me access to the production data. 30% ownership buys you that much. I had known something was coming before the Christmas dinner. I had not known exactly when I would use the plan, but I had known I would. People asked questions. Real questions. I answered them. Damien stood to the side for most of it, arms crossed, saying nothing. Afterward, as people filed out, he found me in the hallway near the conference room door. He took my arm, not roughly, but definitely, and pulled me 2 steps away from the foot traffic. His voice was low and controlled when he asked me what the hell that had been. He said I had ambushed him in front of his entire team. I told him he had invited me. He had put me on stage. He said it was going to blow back on Lauren. I told him Lauren could call me. I would be home by 4. He told me I could not just walk in there after 3 years. I told him I had been there every month, signing his paycheck. I kept my voice at the same temperature it had been since I walked in. I told him he had just never read the fine print. He had nothing for that. A couple of his managers passed us in the hallway and looked at the floor. I turned away from him. I walked back into the conference room, shook Walt's hand, then Tommy Greer's, then Diane Holloway's. Diane held on a second longer than necessary and did not say anything. She did not need to. I walked out through the lobby, through the glass doors, and into the February air. I got in my truck, sat there for a minute with my hands on the wheel, and then drove home. Lauren called at 6:04 that evening. I was eating reheated soup at the kitchen table. Her voice was tight in the way it gets when she has been crying and has decided to stop. She told me Damien was really shaken up. He had worked hard on that presentation. She said I could have talked to him. I could have told him who I was a long time ago. I set down my spoon and told her that 40 families in Harwick were keeping their jobs that week. There was a long silence. Then she asked why I had not just told them. Why had I let him talk to me that way for 3 years and then done that? I told her I did not tell him because she had asked me not to complicate things. I had honored that. She started to say that was not fair, then stopped. Maybe it was not fair, but it was what happened. There was another silence. I could hear her breathing. I told her Damien had never asked, not once, not about the company, not about what I built, not about where the payroll came from, not once in 3 years. The line stayed quiet for a long time. Then Lauren said very softly that she knew. I waited. She told me she would call me later that week. She needed a couple of days. I told her okay. I told her I loved her, and when she was ready to talk for real, I would be there. After we hung up, I sat at the table where Carol and I had eaten every meal for 21 years. The same scratched oak table that had been in my kitchen before Lauren was born. I sat there until the soup went cold. I did not doubt what I had done, but I want that part understood clearly. Not doubting a thing does not mean it was easy. Being right and being at peace are two different things, and sometimes the distance between them is very long. Monday morning, 2 days after the all-hands meeting, I was in the garage reorganizing a shelf when my cell phone rang. It was Richard Chow, the managing partner at Hartwell Capital Group. I set down the wrench I was holding and answered. His voice was measured, the kind of careful voice that comes from having an attorney nearby. He told me they had spent the weekend reviewing the operating agreement, specifically Section 7.3 and Section 4.1. Then he said he wanted to be direct with me. They had not been fully aware of the scope of my retained authority. I told him I understood. He said they wanted to invite me to a formal board meeting in my capacity as retained interest holder, not as a family guest. Then he paused and admitted they should have done it sooner. I told him yes, they should have. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I attended in the same khaki pants and a slightly nicer flannel shirt because I did not own a suit and I was not going to buy one for the occasion. Damien was in the room. He presented Phase 2 again, this time to a board that had read the fine print. They did not reject his plan outright. They were not sentimental people, and they were not wrong that the company needed to modernize. But they required him to incorporate the phased automation proposal as the primary restructuring framework, pending my written approval. Damien shook my hand at the end of the meeting. His grip was firm. His eyes moved. I told him it was a good presentation. He nodded once and walked out. Later, I learned from Frank that Damien's nomination for VP of Operations had been tabled indefinitely pending stakeholder alignment. That is corporate language for what happens when a board discovers it has been working around someone it should have been working with. 38 jobs were still standing. 6 weeks after the all-hands, Lauren showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening without calling ahead. She stood on the porch in her winter coat, hands in her pockets. I opened the door, and she came inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had done homework for 12 years. The same table where I had told her about her mother's diagnosis. I made coffee. She did not say anything for a while. Then she told me she had been thinking about what I said, that Damien had never asked. I poured her a cup and sat across from her. She said he had never really asked about me. He knew the surface version, that I had run a supply company, that I had sold it, but he had never asked what it cost to build it. He had never asked about her mother. Then she paused and said she thought she had stopped asking too, about what I had been going through. I told her that was not her fault. She looked at the table and said she thought it partly was. She told me she had wanted so badly for things to be easy, for everyone to just get along. I told her I knew. Then she said she had kept asking me to be smaller so he would not feel threatened. I did not confirm it. I did not deny it. She already knew. I put my hand on hers. We sat like that for a while, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the February wind against the kitchen window. That weekend, Tyler called me from Damien's phone. 7 years old and already. I thought about how to answer that for a moment. Then I told him I used to own it. Now I just made sure people were treated right. He thought about that and said it sounded like a pretty good job. I told him it was. 2 weeks after Lauren came to the table, Walt Pruitt called me. He said one thing, thank you. Then he hung up. That was enough. A few days after that, a Christmas card arrived, postmarked in February, which is the kind of thing that happens when a man has 4 kids under 10 and a full-time job on a loading dock. It was from Tommy Greer. Inside was a family photo, all 5 of them in matching sweaters in front of a tree. On the back, in his handwriting, he had written that they were still there because of me. I put it on the refrigerator. In the evenings, after all of that happened, I had time to think. I did not set out to humiliate Damien. I set out to protect 40 people who could not protect themselves in that room. The fact that the truth also happened to answer 3 years of dinner table condescension was not my design. That was just how the math worked out. Damien is still employed at Hartwell Industrial. His plan was not entirely wrong. The company does need to modernize. He is not a stupid man. He is a man who confused intelligence with authority and education with wisdom. Those are correctable errors, if a person is willing to correct them. I notified him and the board by email, briefly and professionally, that I would be attending quarterly board meetings going forward in my capacity as retained interest holder, not as a family guest. Damien did not reply. Lauren says he has been quieter at home. I do not know what that means for them, and it is not my place to decide. What I know is this. I built that company with my hands, my credit, and 22 years of early mornings. I never needed Damien to believe that, but 40 families deserve to know someone was still paying attention. He never hired me, but he cashed every check I signed. That is my story. I did not yell.